Collision course. Jamal Carter leaned back against the leather seat of his old SUV, his hands gently gripping the worn steering wheel. Beside him, his 17-year-old daughter, Kayla, scrolled through her phone, oblivious to the rural scenery flying past outside her window. The sunlight was starting to fade, casting long shadows over the empty fields. It had been a long drive, but Jamal didn't mind. He enjoyed moments like these with his daughter, quiet times that had become fewer since he'd accepted the new job as police chief in Pennybrook, a small city known more for its quiet suburban streets than its crime rate. "You hungry?" Jamal asked, breaking the silence as they approached a gas station nestled between miles of farmland. Kayla looked up from her screen, offering a small smile. "I could eat something," she admitted, her eyes brightening slightly. "Grab whatever you want." "It'll be a while before we're home," Jamal said, pulling into the parking lot. The place was nearly empty, just a few scattered cars and a patrol cruiser parked haphazardly across two spots near the entrance. As they exited the car, Jamal stretched, feeling the stiffness in his back after hours of driving. He glanced over at Kayla, who had already disappeared into the brightly lit convenience store, her face illuminated by the screen of her phone as always. Jamal lingered for a moment, breathing in the cool air. He'd spent most of his life in the city, navigating its harsh streets first as a young officer, then as a detective, and now as chief. He was no stranger to prejudice or injustice, having seen both firsthand too many times. Taking the job in Pennybrook was supposed to give him, and Kayla, a fresh start. The city council had promised him a free hand to reshape a department mired in old ways and outdated attitudes. But Jamal knew better. He knew that change, especially in small towns, always came with resistance. Lost in thought, he didn't notice the raised voices inside the convenience store until a sudden sharp cry cut through the stillness of the evening. "Hey, watch it." Jamal's eyes snapped toward the sound. His heart tightened as he saw Kayla, standing rigidly near the entrance, facing a police officer. The cop was a heavy-set man in his mid-40s, red-faced and glaring down at her. His hand was already resting on his belt, fingers curled casually around the butt of his gun. Jamal's instincts flared. He moved swiftly, crossing the short distance to the door as the tension escalated inside. "You got a problem, girl." The officer barked loudly enough to draw the attention of the board cashier and a few customers scattered throughout the store. Kayla's voice was steady, practiced from years of cautious interactions. "No, sir. I'm sorry. I didn't see you there." "Yeah, right," the officer scoffed, shifting his weight, stepping closer. His eyes flicked from her face down to her hands. "What are you doing here anyway?" Jamal pushed the door open, bell jangling, eyes immediately locking onto the cop's name badge. "Officer Kevin Drake." He paused, assessing the situation before jumping in. "I just came in to buy something," Kayla replied, trying to hide the slight tremor in her voice. Jamal recognized the tone, the one she used when she felt cornered, when she had to become smaller, quieter, to avoid confrontation. "You know," Drake said coldly, eyes narrowing, "we've had reports of shoplifting lately. Mind emptying your pockets?" Kayla visibly tensed. Confusion etched across her face. "I just walked in here. I didn't ask for your life story. Empty your pockets. Now." "That's enough," Jamal said sharply, stepping forward into clear view. His voice carried authority, not anger, but firm enough to halt the officer's advance momentarily. Drake glanced briefly in Jamal's direction, clearly irritated by the interruption. He quickly sized him up. A middle-aged black man in civilian clothes, clearly not someone the officer felt intimidated by. "This doesn't concern you," Drake shot back dismissively. "Step back." "She's my daughter," Jamal stated flatly, stepping closer, closing the distance. He felt his pulse quicken, but his demeanor remained controlled. "She hasn't done anything wrong. She's barely been here 2 minutes." Officer Drake turned fully now, giving Jamal this undivided attention. The look in the cop's eyes was dismissive, borderline contemptuous. Sir, I suggest you let me do my job. Harassing teenagers is your job now. Jamal countered evenly. Funny. I missed that part. Drake's jaw tightened, eyes narrowing. Jamal knew the look. He'd seen it hundreds of times on the faces of men just like this officer, men who'd grown used to pushing their weight around, who saw authority as a shield rather than a responsibility. Step back, Drake repeated, more forcefully, or you're going to end up in cuffs yourself. Kayla shot Jamal a worried glance, fear beginning to seep into her eyes. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, forced into a position where any sudden movement could be misinterpreted. Jamal knew how easily these situations could escalate. He'd spent his career dealing with officers who abused their power, who saw aggression as a solution to every perceived slight. Slowly, Kayla reached into her pocket, pulling out a receipt from earlier. Here's my receipt. I haven't stolen anything. Drake reacted as if Kayla had pulled a weapon. With lightning speed, his arm shot forward, knocking her hand away violently. Before Jamal could even move, Drake's fist slammed into Kayla's jaw with brutal force. The sound of the blow echoed sickeningly through the store. Kayla crumpled instantly, collapsing onto the cold tile floor. Her phone skittered across the ground, screen shattering against the display rack. A gasp rippled through the onlookers. Jamal felt his blood run cold. Without thinking, he surged forward, positioning himself between Drake and his daughter's fallen form. What the hell is wrong with you? Jamal's voice thundered, filling the silent store with an intensity that demanded attention. Drake stepped back instinctively, taken aback by the sudden confrontation. She was reaching for something. Drake stammered, voice losing its earlier arrogance. I had to neutralize the threat. Threat? Jamal's voice was dangerously calm now, eyes blazing with barely contained fury. My daughter was showing you a receipt. Sir, back away. Drake demanded again, regaining his bravado as his hand hovered dangerously near his gun. Do it. Now. Jamal slowly reached into his jacket pocket. Drake's eyes widened slightly, muscles tensing as if expecting the worst. Instead of a weapon, Jamal's hand emerged holding a badge. He held it up clearly, deliberately, letting the golden shield catch the fading sunlight filtering through the windows. Drake's eyes flickered, confusion quickly replaced by dawning realization. His face paled, the color draining instantly. Chief Jamal Carter, Jamal stated clearly, his voice echoing through the silent gas station. I'm the new chief of police in Pennybrook. The silence deepened, punctuated only by Kayla's soft, pained groan from the floor. Drake's mouth opened and closed, soundless words dying on his lips. I didn't know. Drake finally managed, desperation creeping into his voice. Chief, I didn't. Jamal cut him off sharply. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. Officer Drake. You're under arrest. Drake hesitated, eyes darting around desperately, searching for an ally, someone who'd come to his defense. But the few onlookers simply stared in shocked silence, cell phones already raised, capturing every second. Chief, Drake pleaded weakly, you don't have to do this here. You just assaulted a minor, Jamal said coldly, stepping forward, voice unwavering. Turn around. Drake hesitated again, eyes flicking between Jamal and Kayla's slowly recovering form. Jamal took another decisive step forward, firmly grabbing Drake's wrist, spinning him, and forcing his arms behind his back. The cuffs clicked shut with a chilling finality. You're finished, Jamal whispered, close enough for only Drake to hear. No badge is going to save you now. Drake didn't reply. His head hung low, humiliation and fear mixing openly in his expression. Jamal turned away from him, kneeling beside Kayla, who stared up at him, confusion and pain mingling in her eyes. Dad, she whispered hoarsely, tears swelling but not falling. I didn't do anything wrong. I know, sweetheart, Jamal said gently, helping her slowly to her feet. This isn't your fault. I promise you, it ends here. As Jamal guided his shaken daughter toward the door, he felt the eyes of everyone in the store on him. Some curious, others silently supportive. He knew this moment would define his tenure in Pennybrook, and it would be just the beginning of a fight long overdue. And he was ready. Lines drawn in sand. By sunrise, Pennybrook had changed forever. A town known mostly for Friday night football and quiet suburban routines suddenly found itself thrust into national headlines. Jamal Carter, barely settled into his role as chief of police, had already triggered a seismic shift by arresting Officer Kevin Drake, a man who'd worn a badge in Pennybrook for nearly 2 decades. Jamal stood at his kitchen window, sipping coffee that had long since gone cold, staring at the crowd already gathering in the park across from his house. Homemade signs waved angrily through the morning mist. Justice for Kayla. Badge isn't above the law. And Fire Officer Drake. Behind him, Kayla shuffled into the kitchen, the swelling on her jaw now deep purple against her caramel-colored skin. Jamal's heart tightened at the sight of her bruises, anger flaring again beneath his calm exterior. Yet, as angry as he felt, he also felt pride in his daughter's resilience. She hadn't cried, hadn't hidden away. Instead, she stood her ground, ready to face whatever came next. "How are you feeling?" Jamal asked quietly, turning away from the window. "Better," she lied softly, trying to force a smile through the pain. "Did you sleep?" Jamal chuckled dryly, setting down his mug. "Not even a minute." Kayla moved beside him, peering out at the crowd that continued to swell. "Are you worried about them?" "No," Jamal answered, resting a comforting hand gently on her shoulder. "They have every right to be angry. This anger isn't new, it's just finally boiling over." The peaceful morning was suddenly interrupted by a sharp knock at the front door. Jamal and Kayla exchanged a glance, knowing it could only be trouble at this hour. Jamal walked slowly to the door, took a deep breath, and swung it open. Standing on his porch was Mayor Samuel Reed, a man who normally thrived on handshakes and diplomatic smiles. Today, however, he looked tense, his tie crooked, hair disheveled as if he'd rushed from bed to this confrontation. "Chief Carter," Reed began abruptly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. His eyes flicked briefly toward Kayla, noting her bruises with discomfort before quickly looking away. "We need to talk, immediately." Jamal nodded slowly, gesturing toward the small sitting room. He caught Kayla's eye and gave her a reassuring nod. "Give us a minute." She reluctantly stepped away, glancing over her shoulder once before disappearing down the hall. Reed wasted no time. "Chief, do you understand what you've done here?" "Yes," Jamal replied calmly. "I've arrested an officer who assaulted an innocent teenager." The mayor scoffed, pacing in tight circles, agitation radiating off him. "You arrested one of Pennybrook's most respected officers in full view of the public. He's got 20 years of connections, chief, friends in City Hall, friends in the union, and friends who donate generously every election." Jamal's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his voice steady. "Respect isn't given by default, Mr. Mayor." Drake violated his oath. He attacked a minor, my daughter, and did so without cause. The badge isn't a license to abuse. "You don't have to lecture me," Reed said bitterly, finally pausing to face Jamal. "But politics aren't black and white. Already, half the council wants you out, and the police union is rallying support to reinstate Drake. They claim you overstepped, that you reacted emotionally." "Emotionally," Jamal repeated quietly, a dangerous edge creeping into his voice. "My daughter was assaulted, Mayor. The only reason Drake was arrested so swiftly was because I witnessed it myself. Had I not been there, he'd be on patrol right now." Reed sighed heavily, rubbing his forehead. "Look, Jamal, I'm on your side here, but this town hates scandal. They're comfortable with the quiet, the status quo." "That comfort is part of the problem," Jamal replied firmly. "Change doesn't come quietly. It comes when enough people refuse to accept things the way they've always been." Reed hesitated, as though measuring his next words carefully. Drake's family has already retained a high-powered attorney. They're threatening a lawsuit, false arrest, emotional distress. They're even claiming that Kayla provoked him. Jamal's eyes flashed with sudden fury, his voice growing colder. Are you seriously suggesting my daughter somehow deserved to be punched in the face? No. Reed raised his hands defensively. But that's their narrative. And they'll fight dirty. This town isn't ready for a public spectacle. Too late, Jamal replied simply. The spectacle began the moment Drake put on that badge and used it as permission to terrorize innocent citizens. This isn't just about Drake. It's about a culture that enabled him. The mayor exhaled heavily, clearly sensing he wouldn't sway Jamal easily. Then brace yourself. You've drawn a line in the sand, and powerful people will fight to maintain control. I can only protect you so much. I don't need protection, Jamal said bluntly. I need support to rebuild trust in this department. Reed nodded slowly, looking defeated as he turned to leave. Then I hope you're ready for the fight. When Reed closed the door, Jamal found Kayla standing in the hallway, clearly having overheard. She stepped forward, eyes filled with uncertainty. Dad, are they gonna fire you for this? Jamal smiled softly, shaking his head. They can try, Kay. But this isn't about my job. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard. She took a shaky breath, suddenly looking younger than her 17 years. But it's not fair. You're doing the right thing. And they still hate you. He pulled her gently into a hug, whispering into her hair. Change always makes people uncomfortable, especially those benefiting from injustice. I knew this wouldn't be easy, but I promise you, I won't back down. A loud chant erupted from outside, snapping both their heads toward the window. Jamal opened the front door, stepping onto the porch. A massive crowd now filled the park and sidewalks, spilling into the street. Citizens of all ages and backgrounds stood united, demanding justice. At the edge of the crowd, Jamal recognized familiar faces: teachers, shopkeepers, even a few off-duty officers. For the first time, Jamal saw Pinebrook's potential to be more than just another quiet town. It could be a place where justice truly mattered. Kayla stood beside him, staring out at the sea of faces, strength slowly replacing fear in her expression. They're not just angry, Dad, she whispered in awe. They're ready. He nodded slowly, feeling resolve harden within him. And so am I. Just then, Jamal's phone buzzed urgently. A message flashed across the screen from his second-in-command, Captain Michel Torres, one of the few officers he trusted completely. Chief, we've got problems. Half the department is threatening a walkout in support of Drake. He sighed, closing his eyes briefly. It wasn't unexpected, but the betrayal still stung. Kayla touched his arm gently, reading the message alongside him. Are they really that afraid of accountability? Jamal stared at the screen for a moment, then looked at his daughter, seeing strength and determination mirrored back at him. They're afraid of change, he admitted quietly. But fear won't stop justice, not this time. He quickly typed back a response to Torres, decisive and firm. Let them go. Pinebrook deserves better. With that message sent, Jamal stood straighter, facing the sunrise over a town now deeply divided. Lines had been drawn clearly, and he knew this conflict was far from over. But as the chants grew louder, clearer, he felt hope rising within him. Pinebrook might not yet be ready, but it was already changing, whether it liked it or not. And Jamal Carter had no intention of turning back. Reckoning. In the days following Officer Drake's arrest, Pinebrook transformed from a quiet town into the epicenter of a national conversation on police accountability. Cameras now lined the sidewalks outside the station. Reporters flocked to the once ignored city hall, and the tension within the community reached fever pitch. Yet, amidst the chaos, Chief Jamal Carter stood firm, determined to see justice served, even as powerful forces marshaled against him. Inside the Pinebrook police station, a tense silence permeated every corner. Officers whispered in clusters, splitting themselves into factions. Some openly supported Chief Carter's decision, others vehemently opposed it, siding with the embattled Officer Drake. Jamal knew this fracture ran deeper than just one incident. It was a divide decades in the making. Jamal sat quietly at his desk, staring down at the growing stack of files before him, each a documented complaint against Drake spanning nearly 15 years, buried beneath departmental bureaucracy. Harassment, intimidation, excessive force, each had been quietly swept aside by previous chiefs who valued unity over accountability. Captain Michel Torres entered quietly, knocking softly on his doorframe. A trusted ally, Torres had proven herself honorable, meticulous, and unafraid to speak the truth, even when unpopular. "Chief, we have an issue," she said solemnly, stepping inside. "Another one?" Jamal asked dryly, setting down his pen. "Let's hear it." Torres closed the door, speaking quietly but firmly. "Union President Rob Owens is holding a meeting at the community center tonight. Rumor is he's pushing hard to reinstate Drake and have you removed." Jamal leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the moment. Not surprising. Owens has always defended men like Drake. Torres' expression tightened. "It's worse. They're recruiting allies, prominent figures, business owners, even a couple city council members. Owens claims you're trying to dismantle the department from the inside. They're labeling you as anti-police, hoping public fear will swing opinion." Jamal exhaled slowly, recognizing the strategy all too well. Attack the messenger, shift blame, stoke fear. They're desperate. Desperate people do dangerous things. Torres cautioned, her voice low and tense. "We need to respond publicly. Now." Jamal stood, his eyes determined. "Then let's make sure people know exactly what they're defending. We need transparency. Every buried complaint against Drake, every report. Release them to the press." Torres hesitated, surprise flickering across her face. "Chief, those records implicate previous administrations. Powerful people protected Drake." "I know," Jamal replied sharply. "That's exactly the point. The public deserves to know the truth, no matter who it implicates. Change won't happen unless the rot is exposed completely." Torres nodded slowly, resolute now. "I'll have it done immediately." As Torres exited, Jamal's phone buzzed again. Mater Reed. The call was short and direct. Reed warned him explicitly that releasing the files would ignite a political firestorm. Yet Jamal was undeterred, knowing the system had to break publicly for healing to begin. By evening, Pinebrook's community center overflowed. Cars jammed parking lots, streets filled with citizens determined to hear arguments firsthand. Jamal arrived alone, without fanfare, quietly taking a seat at the rear, unnoticed at first as the room buzzed with anticipation. Rob Owens, a burly former detective, stood at the podium, voice booming confidently. "Officer Drake is an honorable man who served this town faithfully for 2 decades, Owens declared passionately, to applause from Drake's supporters. Chief Carter arrested him impulsively, emotionally, and unfairly. "We cannot allow outsiders to dismantle our department. Our officers deserve support, not persecution." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the audience, and Jamal felt the familiar sting of isolation. Yet before Owens could continue, a voice rose from the back, clear, confident, and unexpected. "You mean like my daughter deserves support?" Heads turned swiftly toward Jamal, silence replacing applause. Owens stumbled, clearly rattled by Jamal's unexpected appearance. Jamal stood slowly, facing the crowd directly. "Officer Drake assaulted a 17-year-old girl whose only crime was showing a receipt. My daughter was assaulted not because she posed a threat, but because Drake believed he could act without consequence, just as he had countless times before." The silence deepened. Eyes shifted nervously between Jamal and Owens. "I didn't come to Pinebrook to dismantle your department," Jamal continued calmly, stepping forward. "I came here to build one worth trusting. One where a badge isn't a shield against accountability, and justice doesn't depend on the color of your skin or your uniform." Owens scoffed, regaining composure. Chief Carter, you're turning one isolated incident into a circus. Officer Drake has served. Jamal sharply cut him off. How isolated can it be when we have documented reports spanning years? Reports your union buried and dismissed. Owens froze, momentarily speechless. Whispers spread quickly, shock evident among citizens who had been assured Drake's behavior was exaggerated. We released those reports to the media today. Jamal continued, his voice unwavering. Every single one. Excessive force, harassment, targeting minorities, all systematically ignored by those who swore to protect this community. Chaos erupted. Supporters shouted angrily, others cheered passionately. Many sat stunned by revelations long hidden. Owens attempted to regain control, demanding order, but the room had irrevocably shifted. Amidst the chaos, a voice emerged from the crowd, strong yet trembling slightly with emotion. "You're telling the truth, Chief Carter," a woman called out, standing shakily. Jamal recognized her immediately. Elizabeth Ramos, mother of a teenage boy badly beaten by Drake years earlier. I reported Officer Drake. No one listened. My son was labeled a troublemaker, a liar. Now you're finally showing everyone the truth. Another man stood abruptly, anger raw in his voice. Drake arrested my brother for nothing. Called it resisting arrest. The department ignored us. They protected him. One after another, Pinnebrook citizens stood, sharing long-suppressed grievances openly, confronting the complicity of their own community. Owen stood helplessly at the podium, visibly shaken as public opinion rapidly turned against him. Jamal finally stepped forward, taking the microphone from Owens gently but firmly. Tonight proves this isn't about one officer or even one incident. It's about decades of complicity, a culture of silence that must end. The crowd quieted slightly, listening intently. Change isn't comfortable, Jamal said, voice steady yet compassionate. It requires courage, accountability, and honesty. But this is our chance. Pinnebrook can be the example, showing America what happens when justice truly matters more than preserving power. A ripple of applause erupted, swelling into a thunderous ovation. Owens stepped back, defeated, eyes downcast, recognizing his loss of control. As Jamal left the community center, he found Kayla standing by his car, eyes bright but tired. "You think this'll finally make a difference?" she asked quietly, hopeful yet cautious. He embraced her warmly, whispering into her hair, "Tonight, people saw the truth. It's messy, it's painful. But now, they can't look away." Kayla nodded softly, eyes steady. Then it was worth it. Above them, streetlights illuminated banners reading "Justice for Kayla," now joined by dozens more reading "Justice for Pinnebrook." A wave had begun, unstoppable, undeniable. Yet Jamal knew the fight was far from over. Powerful interests never conceded easily. But Pinnebrook had changed, and so had he. He would stand firm, prepared to face the storm he'd unleashed. Because justice wasn't negotiable. Breaking point. As the fallout continued, Pinnebrook found itself deeply divided, the tension palpable in every interaction. The community center meeting had shaken the town awake, revealing decades of buried resentment. For Chief Jamal Carter, this revelation was both a victory and an immense burden, as the struggle to rebuild trust intensified. Days after the community meeting, Jamal sat in his dimly lit office late into the night, poring over countless emails and voicemails. Support flooded in from across the country. Civil rights groups, activists, and even prominent national figures. But at home, the reaction was mixed, complex, and deeply personal. A soft knock at his office door broke Jamal's concentration. He looked up to see Captain Michelle Torres standing in the doorway, a folder clutched tightly in her hand, expression tense. "Chief," she began hesitantly, stepping inside, closing the door behind her. "We might have a serious problem." Jamal exhaled slowly, gesturing for her to sit. "Another threat." Torres shook her head gravely. "Worse. Drake's lawyer filed a civil lawsuit today, not just against you, but against the department and the city. They're claiming defamation, wrongful arrest, and emotional distress. Jamal leaned back heavily, rubbing his forehead, exhaustion deepening his voice. They're desperate. They know the criminal charges are solid, so they're going to attack my credibility and character instead. Torres handed him the file, her voice lower, weighted with concern. They're already pressuring city officials behind closed doors. A few council members seem ready to settle. The mayor is wavering under the pressure. Jamal's gaze darkened as he opened the file. Inside were pages of carefully orchestrated attacks, half-truths twisted into damning narratives. They painted him as impulsive, biased anti-police. They even suggested Jamal himself had a history of disciplinary problems in his previous department. Pure fabrication. They're digging up dirt, Jamal said bitterly, closing the file sharply. Or creating it. Torres nodded gravely. They're willing to destroy you to preserve their image. Some officers have already joined in, privately speaking to reporters, spinning lies, creating division. They're calling it a crisis of leadership. Jamal leaned forward, steadying himself against the desk, voice resolute despite exhaustion. This is exactly why Pennybrook never changed before. Fear of retaliation has always silenced good officers. That ends now. What are you going to do? Torres asked quietly, concern evident in her tone. Jamal's eyes hardened, resolve settling in. I'm going directly to the public. No more closed-door politics. If the city wants a war, I'll fight openly. Transparency terrifies those accustomed to secrecy. Torres nodded slowly, determination rising in her eyes. Tell me what you need. Schedule a press conference. Jamal replied decisively. Tomorrow morning, right outside City Hall. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, sunlight pouring down on City Hall steps, now crowded with media vans, reporters, activists, and citizens eagerly awaiting Chief Carter's address. Jamal stepped forward confidently, ignoring the cameras flashing and microphones thrust in his direction. Standing beside him, Caleb maintained a dignified composure despite visible bruises, her presence symbolizing the true stakes of the battle ahead. Jamal addressed the crowd, his voice calm, strong, unwavering. Today, Pennybrook stands at a crossroads. Officer Kevin Drake assaulted my daughter. This fact isn't up for debate. Yet, instead of accountability, we see deflection and intimidation. Instead of justice, we see attempts to silence those who speak truth. He paused, eyes scanning the faces before him, sensing both hostility and solidarity among them. Officer Drake's lawyers now claim that holding him accountable is unjust, that confronting abuse of power somehow undermines law enforcement itself. This is a lie. Accountability strengthens trust. No officer is above the law, not even one with powerful friends. Suddenly, a voice shouted from the crowd, angry, accusing. You're just here to divide us. Jamal responded firmly, not rattled by the interruption. If justice divides us, it's because injustice kept us comfortable for too long. Real unity cannot exist alongside corruption. Another voice rose, gentler, a woman's voice. What about the officers who've supported Drake for years? Are you going after them too? Jamal nodded thoughtfully. Accountability isn't selective. This department protected Drake. Officers who enabled abuse, silenced victims, or turned a blind eye must face consequences. But for officers willing to serve honestly, ethically, I will stand with you, fight for you, protect you fiercely. Our town deserves that. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Jamal glanced toward Kayla, who offered a reassuring nod. Empowered, Jamal continued, voice steady, conviction radiating outward. Pennybrook must decide. Do we uphold justice or cling to a broken past? I'm here because I believe we can choose better. As applause broke out, Jamal caught sight of Mayor Reed standing at the edge of the gathering, arms crossed, expression unreadable. He'd come quietly, observing silently, a man caught between political pressure and moral obligation. As Jamal stepped back from the podium, Reporters immediately surged forward, bombarding him with questions. Amidst the frenzy, Mayor Reed approached cautiously, speaking low but urgently. "Chief Carter, we need to speak privately." They stepped aside, out of the media's earshot. Reed spoke quickly, his voice tense but sincere. "Listen, Jamal, I respect what you're doing, but understand the city council is ready to cave. Drake's allies have them scared. If you don't back down, they'll terminate your contract." Jamal met his gaze evenly, unyielding. "Mayor Reed, I can't back down. If they fire me, let them explain to Pinnebrook why they chose Drake over Justice." Reed sighed deeply, recognizing Jamal's resolve. "You're gambling your entire career on this." Jamal shook his head calmly. "No, I'm fighting for my daughter, your city, and basic human dignity. If that costs me my badge, it's a price I'm willing to pay." Reed nodded slowly, conflicted yet clearly moved. "Then you have my support, publicly. Let them fire us both." Jamal clasped Reed's hand firmly, gratitude clear. Courage spreads. It's contagious. That evening, chaos erupted within Pinnebrook's police department. Several officers abruptly resigned, siding openly with Drake, believing their resignations would cripple Jamal's ability to maintain order. But unexpectedly, their departure had the opposite effect. Younger officers, previously silenced, now stepped forward boldly, publicly pledging loyalty to Chief Carter's reform. The town watched as battle lines solidified, seeing who chose justice and who clung to old systems. Businesses pulled support from Drake's defense. Influential citizens withdrew backing, embarrassed by the emerging truth. And then, just as the scales began tipping decisively toward justice, news broke suddenly. Officer Drake's criminal trial date had been set, and prosecutors announced they possessed indisputable video evidence, obtained from the convenience store's security cameras. Drake's allies panicked, realizing the truth couldn't be suppressed. The city council hastily withdrew offers of settlement, suddenly distancing themselves, eager to appear supportive of justice, now that accountability seemed inevitable. Yet Jamal knew better than to relax his guard. As long as powerful forces remained, the fight wasn't over. He and Kayla stood quietly on their porch that night, watching peaceful demonstrations wind through Pinebrook streets, now carrying banners demanding lasting reform. "You think things will really change?" Kayla asked softly, hopeful but cautious. Jamal wrapped an arm protectively around her shoulder, voice gentle but resolute. "Real change never comes easily. It always faces resistance. But Pinnebrook's people woke up. They see the system's flaws, the cost of silence. That's the first step. Now we fight to keep their eyes open." Kayla leaned into him, bruises beginning to heal, spirit stronger than ever. "Then we keep fighting." Beneath a sky ablaze with stars, Jamal felt hope stirring. The battle had begun with violence and pain, but perhaps it would end in healing, accountability, and genuine justice. Yet, deep down, Jamal knew one final battle loomed: the courtroom, where truth and justice would finally collide openly, deciding Pinnebrook's future once and for all. And he was ready. Justice unveiled. The courtroom buzzed with restless energy as the sun rose over Pinnebrook, casting long golden streaks through the tall courthouse windows. Today wasn't just another day. It marked a turning point in Pinnebrook's history, a reckoning for Officer Kevin Drake and the culture that had protected him for so long. Chief Jamal Carter sat silently in the front row, his presence commanding yet dignified, eyes locked on the wooden doors leading to the hallway. Beside him, Kayla sat quietly, her bruises now faded, but the memories permanently etched into her eyes. Jamal glanced sideways at his daughter, feeling pride surge within him. Her strength throughout this ordeal had inspired an entire town. Finally, the heavy doors swung open. Officer Drake entered, flanked by his attorney, a sharply dressed, ruthless lawyer named Julian Monroe, renowned for getting officers off the hook. Drake walked confidently, his eyes defiant, clearly convinced he would prevail again. But this time was different. The truth had never been clearer. All rise. The courtroom stood as Judge Marissa Elliott took her seat. An older woman, respected for fairness and compassion, her presence alone commanded reverence. Judge Elliott's eyes quickly assessed the packed courtroom. Please be seated. Today, the court hears the state versus Kevin Drake. Mr. Monroe, are you prepared? Julian Monroe rose smoothly, buttoning his tailored suit jacket. Yes, Your Honor. Prosecution. Assistant District Attorney Claudia Ramirez stood sharply, determined and confident. Ready, Your Honor. Jamal watched closely, knowing Ramirez was a relentless advocate for justice. They'd spoken frequently over the past weeks, meticulously reviewing evidence, ensuring that every detail stood up against Monroe's inevitable attacks. The prosecution's case was swift, precise, and devastating. Witness after witness testified, beginning with Jamal himself. On the stand, he calmly recounted the incident at the gas station, describing Drake's aggression vividly, his voice measured but tinged with suppressed anger. He painted a chilling portrait of a badge-turned-weapon. Next was Kayla. As she stepped onto the witness stand, the courtroom grew silent, her presence instantly powerful. Jamal held his breath, pride and worry twisting within him. Kayla's testimony was clear, unshakable, and brutally honest. I never provoked him, she declared softly but firmly, eyes fixed unflinchingly on Drake. He hurt me because he believed he could get away with it, because he'd always gotten away with it. Monroe attacked viciously, his questions designed to undermine her credibility. Yet Kayla stood firm, poised despite relentless attempts to portray her as hostile or aggressive. Each question intended to break her only revealed her strength more clearly. Ramirez then introduced the security camera footage. As the video played silently, a collective gasp filled the courtroom. The images were undeniable. Drake's brutal punch, Kayla's painful fall, Jamal's swift intervention, and Drake's shocked reaction upon discovering Jamal's true identity. The atmosphere shifted dramatically. Even Drake's most ardent supporters now stared at the footage, visibly shaken. Monroe attempted a desperate argument. My client believed Miss Carter was reaching for a weapon. His reaction was justified given his training and perceived threat. Ramirez stood sharply, voice ringing powerfully through the courtroom. A receipt is not a weapon, Mr. Monroe. Officer Drake didn't react to a threat. He created one. The prosecution rested decisively, leaving Monroe scrambling to regain ground. As the defense began, Drake took the stand confidently, visibly rehearsed. I acted to protect myself and others, he claimed smoothly. It was instinct. I regret the misunderstanding, but I acted appropriately. Ramirez cross-examined calmly but ruthlessly. Officer Drake, do you consider a 17-year-old girl showing you a receipt a legitimate threat? Drake hesitated momentarily, clearly uncomfortable. It looked suspicious. Ramirez leaned forward. Suspicious because she was black. Monroe objected loudly, but Judge Elliott allowed the question. Drake's eyes shifted nervously. Race wasn't the factor. Ramirez quickly responded, voice sharp. Yet nearly 80% of your excessive force complaints involve minority citizens. Just a coincidence. The courtroom murmured loudly. Drake's confidence faltered visibly, face reddening under scrutiny. Objection. Monroe interjected again, panic evident. But the damage was done. The jury had already seen Drake's discomfort. Closing arguments soon began. Monroe appealed passionately to tradition, loyalty, respect for officers, emotional appeals designed to shift attention away from Drake's violent action. Ramirez countered brilliantly, her voice steady and persuasive. Badge or not, accountability matters. Drake assaulted Kayla Carter simply because he believed he could. His actions weren't protective. They were abusive. This case isn't just about one punch. It's about who we are as a community. Do we protect power or pursue justice? Her words resonated deeply. The jury withdrew for deliberation, the courtroom growing tense with anticipation. Hours passed slowly. Jamal and Kayla waited silently, tension heavy. The courtroom filled again when the jury finally returned, the verdict sealed in a small envelope. Judge Elliott carefully unfolded the paper, speaking solemnly. In the case of the state versus Kevin Drake, on charges of assault and battery of a minor, the jury finds the defendant guilty. A wave of relief swept through Jamal. Kayla squeezed his hand tightly, eyes bright with emotion. Drake's confident demeanor shattered instantly, disbelief flashing across his face. Monroe's jaw tightened, humiliation obvious. The judge continued sternly, her voice firm yet compassionate. "Officer Drake, your actions betrayed your oath and damaged public trust. Your badge carries responsibility, not immunity. Therefore, the court sentences you to 3 years in prison, effective immediately." Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Drake stood frozen, mouth agape, as bailiffs handcuffed him swiftly, leading him away. Monroe stood silently, defeated. Outside the courthouse, media swarmed. Jamal approached the microphones confidently, Kayla beside him, composed and dignified. Jamal spoke clearly, his voice resonating deeply. "Today, justice was delivered, not just for my daughter, but for Pinebrook. Accountability isn't optional, it's essential. Our town can now begin healing. To officers who serve honorably, you have my gratitude. To those who abuse their power, your time is up." Cheers erupted spontaneously from supporters. Pinebrook citizens, once divided, now stood united, hopeful, determined. That evening, Jamal and Kayla stood quietly on their front porch, watching citizens peacefully celebrating, a hopeful calm settling over Pinebrook for the first time in weeks. Kayla broke the comfortable silence softly. "You think this is really over?" Jamal sighed thoughtfully. "This case, yes, but the fight for justice, that never ends. Pinebrook took a step forward, but now we have to protect it, every day." Kayla smiled faintly, determination glowing. "Then we will." Together, they stood side by side, ready to protect the fragile victory they'd achieved. Pinebrook's battle was far from over, but for the first time, Jamal saw genuine hope reflected in the faces around him. Justice had spoken, and Pinebrook finally listened.